Hello everyone and welcome to Chess University's Chess Openings 101. This is FM Arne Jochens speaking and I'm here to introduce you to the Queens Gambit Declined. This video course consists of 4 videos in all, and in this first video I'm going to give a general introduction to the opening, and then I'm going to look at 2 of the old main lines in this opening that are still very relevant today, namely the Lasker and the Capablanca defenses. So what exactly is the Queen's Gambit? Well, there are several move orders to reach the basic starting position, but most often it starts with 1 d4, which is of course a very good opening move because it follows 2 of the basic opening principles. White is obviously fighting for control of the center, with this pawn controlling the central square e5, also controlling the square c5, and now the queen is controlling the central square d4. And of course white is preparing to develop this bishop. The only opening principle this move does not directly address is white is doing nothing to get the king safer. In fact, you could argue white is slightly weakening his king's position by opening up the king to potential checks along this diagonal. And white is still at least 4 moves away from castling. So keep this in mind. This will be relevant in a number of lines we're going to look at, that sometimes the white king is not as secure as it would be, for example, if white starts with e4 and quickly goes for kingside castling. But of course this is still a very good move. And also it introduces a bit of a positional threat. If white is allowed to, he would be very happy to follow up with e4, getting 2 pawns in the center. So most of black's defenses at this point prevent this move e4, either with knight f6 or the most straightforward and the classical move, of course, d5. For the same reasons that d4 is a very good move, d5 is also a very good move for black. And now white cannot play e4 unless he's prepared to sacrifice a pawn. So if white wants to fight for the center, the most straightforward approach to do this is to play c4. Now this course is mainly about the Queen's Gambit Declined, which means that black does not capture the pawn on c4. But I should mention that the Queen's Gambit, despite the name, is not really a gambit at all, because if black does take the pawn on c4, there is usually not a good way for him to keep the extra pawn. So a gambit is of course an opening where someone is sacrificing material, but this c4 move is not yet a real sacrifice because, well, for one thing, if white wanted to, white could regain the pawn straight away with this queen check and then capture on c4. But of course it would be even better from a development point of view to eventually capture on c4 with the bishop. So at this point e3 is a good move. The most straightforward move to prepare bishop takes c4 would be to play e4, but well, this would allow black to play e5 with some prospects of gaining compensation for the pawn. So the main line actually is knight f3 at this point to simply prevent this move e5 securely, and now white is planning to move the e-pawn and eventually capture on c4 with the bishop. But this is really a complicated opening in its own right, the Queen's Gambit accepted. So it's not really the topic of this course. But keep in mind, the Queen's Gambit is not a real gambit, because in these positions black should be prepared to return the pawn. If black tries to hang on to the extra pawn, he may well lose very quickly in the opening, because white will get a strong center and a lead in development. So d takes c4 would lead to the Queen's Gambit accepted, and the Queen's Gambit Declined is introduced by the move e6. So this is what this course is really about. Black simply defends the pawn on d5 in a very solid way. And this is the Queen's Gambit Declined. Now, despite being very solid, there's one obvious drawback to this move, which is that the bishop on c8 is now not so easy to develop actively. And this is in fact one of the main themes in many of the lines that can follow from this position. In many of the lines, Black tries to solve the problem of how to develop this bishop actively in one way or another, and these different ways will introduce the different subsystems that Black has available from this position. And I should also mention that of course the Queen's Gambit has a very rich history, because, well, even if you only look at the World Championship matches or just the World Champions themselves, basically every World Champion has played the Queen's Gambit, most with both colors. And, well, there was one famous case, of course, the 1927 match between Aljechin and Capablanca, where both players played this opening with both white and black, and in 32 of the 34 games of the match this position was reached. And, well, I should also mention that because this move is very solid, Black is not going for an unbalanced pawn structure necessarily. He just wants to hold the d5 point, fortify the d5 point to make sure white doesn't gain too much space. But there is a potential drawback to this, which is that sometimes it can be hard for Black to play for a win. At least if white is satisfied with a calm position and white does not show any ambitions, then it may be hard to play for a win. But on the other hand, it's still too early to really tell. The pawn structure may still become unbalanced in a number of ways, and also there are still all the pieces on the board, so there's certainly still a lot of scope for error for both sides here, even if the position is not very sharp straight away. Now let me outline how I will distribute the material over the 4 videos. So as I already mentioned in this first video, we are going to look at 2 old main lines, the Lasker and the Capablanca defense. Then in the second video we are going to look at some other lines that I think are also very important. And in video number 3 we will be looking at what is known as the exchange variation, when white captures on d5 early on. And there we will also look at a complete game that I consider to be a model game for white of how to play the resulting pawn structures. And finally, in video number 4, we are going to look at another old main line called the Tartakova variation, and there we will also see a model game for how to handle the resulting pawn structure with the black pieces. But for now, let me also mention 2 other alternatives to this move, e6. So another way to defend this pawn very solidly is of course the move c6, but this is again a different opening called the Slav defense, which is very interesting, but again not really the topic of this course. And you may wonder, why does Black not simply defend the pawn with the knight? Or why does he have to defend the pawn at all? Isn't the pawn still defended by the queen? Well, that's true, but white has a positional threat here, I would say, which is to capture the pawn, and if the queen captures, then white is going to win time with knight c3, attacking the queen while developing the knight. And similarly, if Black defends the pawn with the knight, white can take, and again Black has to capture with a piece. Let's say Black captures with the knight. This is sometimes called the Marshall defense, because Frank Marshall used to play this in a number of games. And there is a little trick here to know. So the most straightforward move for white would be to play e4, which looks like a great move, creating a strong center with gain of time. But there's a problem with this approach, which is that after knight f6, white would like to defend the center, of course, knight c3. But now again this move e5 is quite interesting. You can see that Black is also developing quickly, and in these early complications there doesn't seem to be a straightforward way for white to keep a clear advantage. For example, if we take the pawn, Black may exchange queens, and play knight g4, targeting both of these pawns. And also note knight f2 is not only targeting the pawn but also threatening a fork here against the rook and the king. So black has counterplay in these lines. That's why if black defends with the knight while taking once is a good move. But now you shouldn't hurry to play this move e4, but first make sure that black cannot play e5 as in the line we just looked at. So the best move here is knight f3. And only then are we going to play e4, hitting this knight. The only way black can try to prevent this move e4, well, I suppose he could play f5, but this looks really ugly. The only sensible way to try to prevent e4 would be to play bishop f5. But whenever black develops this bishop early in these Queen's Gambit type positions, you should think about the b7 pawn, because whenever this bishop is developed early, the b7 pawn is no longer defended. And this often means that queen b3 is then a strong move. And this position is no exception. So we attack the pawn on b7. And black has to play an awkward move to deal with this. With the bishop on f5, obviously he doesn't really want to play b6, which would weaken the light squares on the queen side. Queen c8 is impossible here because the queen has to keep defending the knight. So white has a nice initiative already in this position. That's why knight f6 is considered to be an inferior move in this position. Just remember to play knight f3 before going for e4 on this line. But back to the main line, e6. Now black is still not really threatening to take on c4 because what I said about that still applies. White could regain the pawn unless black would be prepared to grant white a big lead in development. So white can simply increase the pressure and develop with knight c3. And now the main lines, the classical lines, or the orthodox defense of the Queen's Gambit, starts with knight f6. Again, a solid developing move, reinforcing the d5 point and simply developing the knight to its best square. Now, as I mentioned, white can take on d5, so if white takes on d5 in this position, we will reach one version or another of what is known as the exchange variation. And this is going to be covered in video number 4. But the main line of the Queen's Gambit is to play bishop g5. Another very strong developing move, and again, indirectly with this move, white is increasing the pressure against d5. And indeed, we have a positional threat now. For example, if black plays h6, this would be a bad mistake at this point, because white can take the knight, and now you see black would like to capture with the queen to keep his pawn structure intact, but this would just lose a pawn now, because the pawn on d5 would be insufficiently defended. So black would be forced to take with the pawn, but even so white would take on d5, and now you can see black gets a very ugly structure here with these doubled and isolated pawns, and white would have a clear advantage here. So that's why bishop g5 is a strong move. It's not only a developing move, but it also keeps the initiative by introducing this threat to take on f6 or d5 in any order. So black usually plays bishop e7 to unpin the knight, and also so that if white takes on f6, the bishop could capture and the queen would still be covering the d5 pawn. So now usually white keeps developing e3. Note that this move is only played once the bishop has gotten out to g5, so white is not limiting his queen's bishop by playing this move e3, in contrast to black, who played e6 before developing this bishop. Now at this point black could play h6, but he can also delay the decision whether or not to play this move h6 one more move and first castle. Now the most natural move for white is to play knight f3. Note that white is not in a hurry to develop the king's bishop, because whenever white plays bishop e2 or bishop d3, then it gets more interesting for black to capture on c4, because then white would lose a tempo by recapturing with the bishop. So in many lines in the Queen's Gambit, white delays developing this bishop. And knight f3 is a very natural move to play first. Now, from this point we are going to look at two classical variations in this first video of the course. And the Lasker variation is the one we are going to look at first, and this starts by playing this move h6 now. Now this is a controversial move because it can be useful for black to create a potential escape square for the king, and also to control the g5 square to make sure no white piece can attack the black king from g5. But on the other hand, whenever you play h6 and you have castled kingside, you have to be aware of the fact that this can also be a weakness. Sometimes there may be sacrifices on h6, but also in some lines white may be able to play g4 and g5, attacking this pawn. So it's not obvious whether it's useful for black or not to play this move h6. White should not capture on f6 unless there's a very good reason to do so, because, well, black would get the two bishops, obviously. So usually white plays bishop h4, although some people have tried taking on f6 at some point. But let's go with the main line here, bishop h4. And now Lasker's idea was to play this move knight e4 to exchange a couple of pieces, and eventually his main idea is to break in the center with e5, freeing the light squared bishop after all. And this is still a very interesting line for black to play. Of course there are alternatives at this point. Knight e4 is by no means forced, and by far the most important alternative here is for black to play this move b6 to develop the light squared bishop by a queenside fianchetto. And this is known as the Tartakova variation, and we are going to cover this in video number 4. But for now let's stick with knight e4. So the bishop on h4 is attacked, of course. If white plays bishop g3, black could simply take the bishop, again gaining the two bishops, so white really doesn't have much of a choice. The dark squared bishops are exchanged. But now in this position white does have a choice, and it's not clear what the best move is, although, well, theory seems to have converged on the view here that this waiting move rook c1 is probably white's best try for an advantage. So let's look at this. Again, white is not in a rush to develop the light squared bishop, because when he develops the light squared bishop, say if he plays bishop d3 instead of rook c1, then black could, well, he could take on c3, but the main point is black is going to take on c4, and again white has lost a tempo here by moving the bishop and then capturing on c4. And here black is probably equalizing quite easily. For example, here he could simply play b6 to develop this bishop to b7 after all. And he also still has Lasker's original idea to play knight d7 and eventually play e5 to equalize the space situation in the center. So that's why it makes sense for white to play some waiting move instead of developing the bishop. And rook c1 is obviously a useful move because the c-file is likely to be half opened in the near future, so white may hope to get some pressure against the c7 pawn maybe, unless black plays c6. But even then the rook could be useful on the half open file. And also now, if black ever takes on c3, white has the additional option to take with the rook, and sometimes the rook may get active along the third rank, as we are going to see. So indeed, this idea to get some pressure against c7 should be taken seriously, and also black still wants to prepare this move e5. But obviously he cannot play e5 straight away because the pawn on d5 would be hanging. So the classical move c6 is very interesting here. It may look a bit odd to put another pawn on a light square when the dark squared bishops have already been exchanged. But, well, there's this straightforward idea to play knight d7 and e5 to free the light squared bishop. And if the bishop can eventually get to g4, say, well, then it's not a problem that black has put another pawn on a light square. Now white cannot keep waiting forever. At some point he's going to have to develop the light squared bishop. And this is probably a good moment to do so. Bishop d3 now. But again, black is going to take the tempo, take on c3. Now this time white can take with the rook, but still, black is going to take on c4, so the bishop has to move again. And now black should play knight to d7, because he still wants to play this freeing move e5. And you can see there's no way for white to prevent this move, so the best white can do is try to get a lead in development to be prepared for the opening of the center. Castles kingside, e5. And now if white takes on e5, this is only going to help black because, well, the knight can come to a central square with gain of time, and black is also getting closer to develop the bishop, obviously. So in this position, again, probably the best move is kind of a waiting move, and this is something that Karpov came up with in his candidates match against Yusupov. He played this strong move bishop to b3. This is really a multi-purpose move. The rook gets more scope down the c-file. The bishop is not going to be attacked in case of the black knight ever showing up on e5. Also, the bishop is now on a very secure square, but it still keeps some pressure, obviously, along this diagonal. So white is hoping to somehow, once the center opens up a bit, transform his lead in development into an attack on the black king. And this is quite dangerous. For example, in one of the original games from the candidates match I mentioned, Karpov against Yusupov, Yusupov tried to equalize in a very straightforward manner by taking on d4. Karpov recaptured with the pawn. So now we reach a typical pawn structure known as an isolated queen's pawn structure, which, as you may know, is often very double-edged. White has more space and quite active pieces, but in the long term black may have the better structure, because if black manages to exchange some minor pieces, in the end this pawn on d4 might end up as a weakness. But, well, let's see what happened in that game. Yusupov played knight to f6, very logical, trying to blockade the pawn by putting the knight on d5. Rook e1, queen to d6, knight to e5, knight to d5, and now you can see how useful this move rook c1, rook takes c3, this maneuver was, because now this rook gets to the king side. Rook to g3. And it turns out that this is quite unpleasant for black. White gets a dangerous attack here. Of course, a computer would probably easily hold this with black, but for a human player it's not so pleasant to play. You have to defend for quite some time, and well, Karpov won a spectacular game the first time this position was reached. So, well, maybe we should look at one continuation here, which is going to be relevant if we compare this whole Lasker variation with the Capablanca variation, as we're going to do in a few minutes. So let's look at this variation, bishop e6, which is a sensible defensive move and also a developing move. But here the problem is that white can play the strong move queen to d2, as in a game Portisch-Bychowski. And this is very strong because obviously white is threatening to take the pawn on h6, relying on the fact that the g-pawn is pinned. And this would not only win a pawn, but also threaten queen takes g7 checkmate. So again, white has a very strong initiative, a very dangerous attack. And we should note that this defensive try queen b4 does not work so well here. It does prevent queen takes h6, because that would be a blunder, as the rook on e1 would be hanging with check, and checkmate even, so in that line black would get to checkmate first. But the problem here is that white can now get an initiative in an endgame instead, because white can simply exchange the queens and rely on his active pieces here to get some edge in the endgame. Maybe more than an edge, because white can take. So black already has a dubious pawn structure here, and now white has a strong initiative with this nice switchback move, rook to b3, targeting both the knight and the pawn on b7. Well, I think black can still avoid losing a pawn by some clever tactics here with a5, a3, knight c2, and so on. But regardless, white is keeping the initiative in this position. Rook d1, black can try rook f5, so that after rook takes b7, he has this little tactic, knight takes d4, removing the guardian of the e5 knight. But well, white is going to have two active rooks, and as long as he notices the back rank threat, white is going to keep a strong initiative. Two very active rooks and many weak pawns in black's position. So this is a clear advantage for white. Okay, so if we return to this position up after Karpov's strong move bishop to b3, that is why it's not so easy for black to equalize in this isolated queen's pawn position that could arise if black now captures on d4. So in more recent games, black has tried to delay the capture a little bit, for example playing rook d8 first. Even Magnus Carlsen has played this. And well, this may be a better try to equalize, but even so, it's not so easy for black to equalize completely. Here white has this clever move rook e1, still anticipating black to take on d4. And well, there really is not much else that black can do eventually, because he wants to develop this bishop, but as long as the pawn is on e5, the knight cannot move, because then e5 would be hanging. So sooner or later black has to take here, and again we reach an isolated queen's pawn position. And this exact position has been reached in a number of games, and black may be close to equalizing, but there's one critical move for white. So you may want to think about this. You can pause the video, of course, if you like, and think about what is the most dangerous attacking move at white's disposal in this position. And despite the fact that this position has been reached in a number of Grandmaster games, only in one game did white play this, what I regard as the critical move. And the answer is, the most dangerous move is g4. Very committal, obviously, but at the same time very logical. Since the pawn is on h6, once white plays g5, there is going to be a threat to open up the position. Now you may say this is also going to be dangerous for the white king as well as the black king, but the point is white still has a lead in development, with the bishop on c8 and the rook on a8 still not playing. So when the position opens up, when both kings get open, this could favor white. So this is really dangerous, and this was played in only one game as far as I can tell, Gajewski against Chochua. And that game continued. Knight f6, very logical, bringing the knight to the king's side and preparing to develop the bishop. g5, knight to d5, and now again this move knight e5. Well, this move was not played, but I think this is the critical continuation. Knight e5 simply centralizing the knight, similar to Karpov's older game, preparing to get the rook over to the king's side. And the tactical point is that black cannot win a pawn by taking on g5, because then we have this double attack with queen h5. And again, white keeps a very strong initiative. Queen f6, rook f3, bishop f5. This is more or less forced, but now white can simply win a pawn by taking on f7. Queen takes, knight takes, and well, I don't know what the most precise continuation is, maybe bishop g4, but in any case white is going to keep an extra pawn. Knight takes d8, bishop takes f3, knight takes b7, being one example. So here white keeps an extra pawn. Now, of course, not all of this was forced, but it shows that in these lines, in some positions, having played the move h6 is actually a disadvantage for black, because it can be an attacking target for white. So in this position the move g4 is very dangerous. And this fact that sometimes h6 can be a problem was already appreciated by maybe the greatest defensive player or the greatest technical player of all time, Capablanca. And that's why he came up with a different defensive setup. If we go back all the way to this position, instead of playing h6 here, Capablanca used to play the move knight b to d7. And the idea is very similar to Lasker's variation. He also wants to prepare this move e5 to break in the center with e5 eventually, but he wants to do it without including the move h6. So let's look at what can happen after this. Essentially white can play in very much the same way as in the Lasker variation. So let's compare the lines. Rook c1, c6, bishop d3. And now once again, as soon as the bishop has moved, black can win this tempo by taking on c4 now. And here you can see how similar the lines really are, the Lasker and the Capablanca defenses, because now black can play this move knight to d5. Again, white has nothing better than to exchange the bishops. And as soon as black takes on c3, we reach exactly the same position as in the Lasker defense, except for the fact that this pawn is still on h7. Which once again can be an advantage for black, because h6 is not a target. But at the same time, in some lines it can also be a disadvantage, obviously, because of a potential back rank weakness. So it's still not clear which line is better, to play h6 or to not play h6. But I want to show you one example where we can see how it can be advantageous for black to have the pawn on h7. So if white simply castles in this position, then black can take on c3, rook takes c3, and play this freeing move e5. And now if white plays a la Karpov with bishop to b3, then black can be happy to go into this isolated queen's pawn position, because now there is a key tactical difference in one of the key lines. If white plays as Karpov did against Yusupov, and black simply plays the same moves as well, queen to d6, knight e5, knight to d5, rook to g3. In this position it's really good for black that the pawn is not yet on h6, because in this position black can simply play the solid move bishop e6. And now remember, in the Lasker variation the problem here with the pawn on h6 was that the move queen d2 was very strong, attacking the pawn on h6. But in this position, if white plays queen d2, there is no pawn on h6 that would be threatened, and the move queen h6 without taking a pawn can be easily diffused here by just playing the rook somewhere, so that after queen h6 we can simply defend with queen f8. And here it turns out that white's attack is not really getting anywhere, so I would say black has equalized here at least. So that's a key difference. And well, if queen d2 is not so strong, maybe white should just play queen h5. And this was in fact played in a game between two amateur players, McPhillips against Kobayashi. But once again black has counterplay here, because now queen b4 can be played, threatening queen takes e1 checkmate. And white can still try to play actively, but this is obviously very double-edged, because now white's back rank is also weak. Black can play queen d2, a multi-purpose move, threatening queen c1, but also getting in touch with some squares on the king side to prevent queen h6, for example. So this is a double-edged position, but I think black has enough counterplay. And that would be one example of a line where not having played h6 is really useful for black. So the general conclusion is, well, we cannot really say if the Lasker variation is better than the Capablanca variation or vice versa, but you always have to pay attention to these details, and playing h6 can have very far-reaching consequences. So this is true in any opening almost. If you have an opportunity to play the move h6 with gain of time, you should still think very carefully about it, whether this is going to help you or hurt you in the long run. And in many positions it's practically impossible to tell, so you may just have to trust your intuition. Okay, so that's all for video number 1. Again, in video number 2 we are going to look at some other important lines, and then in videos numbers 3 and 4 we are going to look at 2 model games. So see you there.